Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. To start with, today we have a question about a community being necessary. It says, I've been hearing about a community being needed to rear a child. Is it true? Well, needs much less than a community. Excuse me, and it needs much more, a child does. You know, we have a peculiar situation in our society, peculiar in this sense. It's been well known for a very long time in family life studies that if you have a closed family, you can have open societies. If you have a closed society, you can have open families. In other words, there's always been a barrier, there's been limitations. Right now, the peculiar thing is we have open societies, societies with virtually no limits. We also have open families. And what happens? The children are now basically not having limitations. There's no protection, and I think that's a very sad situation. So, rather than saying we need a community to rear a child, no, we need to tighten up. We need to put things back in a perspective so that a child has some limitations, can feel the protection, can feel the security of a family. See, in the societies where the family is open, then other adults are also acting as parents and parent surrogates when the society is closed. So it's sort of like an extended family. But we don't have that. That's not what's going on today. So no, I don't agree with the idea that we need a community to rear a child. Here's another one. Coming down the pike, it says, my boyfriend was caught with somebody else. We've been living together for 6 months. What should I do? What would you recommend? My statement was learn to get along without him. If you were married, I'd recommend marriage counseling. But I'd also recommend that if you've been living together and he goes out with somebody else, he's not the one you should marry if that's what's on your mind. People usually get worse instead of better when that sort of thing happens. Set your standards. Live by them. If that's not part of what you believe in, then don't get involved with that. Here's another one. Well, it's almost flip side. It says, my wife was very experienced when we got married. We got married at St. John's Church, and I've started worrying about her being faithful. What can I do? Okay, you got married in the church. Let's assume that you started on an even playing field, that everybody was properly disposed at the time. Let's say that you had a mass, excuse me, or you had a sacramental wedding, and the marriage is a sacramental marriage. So whatever the experience was before you got married, you or your wife, that's history. That should not be coming into the picture now. So if you don't have any really good reason to think she's running around, just don't start digging. It's much better to just live out your vows. You took vows. She did too. Try to make the best you can. And sometimes men seem to have a bigger problem with that than women. Sometimes men have a hard time reconciling the fact that their wife was one time with somebody else, even though it may have been years before they got married. Men seem to have a harder time with that than women do. So, no more than what you said, chalk it up. That may be what's going on. Well, here's another one. How closely do you recommend people have children close in age? This came up in a discussion. And you know that I think about 2 years. Some people insist 3 is a minimum. Others have said 4. I've heard 5. But 2 years is about what nature does. Here's what happens in societies where there are no technological advances, no modern medicine, no birth control. Women are breastfeeding the babies. You know what? The babies are about 22 months apart. And I think that's probably in nature's way. Here's an advantage of about 2 years apart for children. They can enjoy each other as they grow up. Be a real support, a real pleasure. And I've seen that, and I think that's great. Gives a mother a break. Speaking of giving mother a break, another question came down in discussion. It says, when should children be diaper trained? I was in a home the other day sort of visiting respite care. Little child with a big diaper. What I've been saying lately to people is when a child can spell diaper, it's much too late. They should have been diaper trained before. But when they come in to mother to try to be polite and say D-I-A-P-E-R, they should have been trained a long time ago. Actually, there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of material written about this, but not lately. It used to be in the 40s and 50s. There was a lot of concern about when to toilet train children. The psychoanalysts got into it. Freud wrote up a bunch of stuff about it. Other people, like if you toilet train people, if you insisted on a child being toilet trained, you're going to give them a neurosis or something. Hogwash. There's a culture in the South, and I personally observed it, I've seen it, in the lower socioeconomic levels of the black families. Children are typically toilet trained at 9 to 10 months. They don't have any more problems. I haven't seen it, but I've read that the nomads on the desert, the families, the babies there are toilet trained very early. Very early. I haven't seen it myself, but I've read of it, that those people who live in the jungles and carry the children with them, the child slung over the back, they're toilet trained very early. Of course, the mother in those circumstances can sense the child's discomfort when it grunts or starts struggling or something like that. But I see people now with the plastic diapers. They don't have to wash them anymore. They don't seem to care. Well, if the child isn't trained by 3, then maybe we'll start. That's not natural, in my opinion. When we're born, we come equipped. Different from some animals. We have a bladder, which is for storage, and we have a sigmoid colon, which is for storage. And it doesn't have to be a constant excretion. So toilet train makes a big difference. The development of the child and so on is a factor. But I think any child ought to be toilet trained before 2. You don't agree with me? Let me know, but give me your reasons. Here's one says, I went to a meeting the other day of senior citizens. Their senior citizen groups meet right here at the town hall. They're all over the place, as you know. Said there were no men there. Why is that? Well, anybody who's been dealing with senior citizens at all knows that women outnumber men. There are more old women than there are old men. And that's true in every society. The weaker sex lives longer. If they can make it through the childbearing years, that used to be the killer for women, then they live longer in every society. And that's what you see. The ratios vary a little bit because of modern medicine, but it's still consistent all over the world. Another question says, are children really learning more today and they don't act like it? Well, what they're learning doesn't seem to fit in with some expectations. Yes, I think children are learning a great deal more today technologically. But if you've been listening or reading any of the media, you know there's a lot of controversy about teaching character and character building in schools and whether or not to have morality taught in school. And people get into all kinds of hassle about, okay, but whose morality, mine or yours? Well, there's a common morality. It'll fit any society. That shouldn't really be the problem. I had a rather distraught parent the other day who said, at what age can I expect a child to get good sense? I have a 14-year-old and I keep waiting. Well, the 14-year-old looked 18, so the parent had the expectation that the child would talk and relate as an 18-year-old. But you know, a child 12, 13 typically can't really think like an adult. It's not their fault. They may look older than they did when grandma was that age, but they really don't have a capacity to reason without experiencing what they're talking about. That's another way of saying they don't have the capacity for abstract thought. You have to do something physically, actually be involved with it before they get a real understanding. Now, the adult, hopefully, doesn't need to do that. An adult can picture something and figure out how it's going to work or not work before experiencing it. That makes, let's hope, a little more mature judgment. Don't expect too much of the children in terms of abstract reasoning. That doesn't mean you shouldn't expect them to comply with rules. A child of 5, 6 on up, 10, 12 certainly knows enough and can think in terms of specific rules, conduct of behavior. That's not an excuse not to be disciplined. Well, here's one. Lady says, my husband and I went to marriage counseling a year ago and things were going okay for a while because we went because he was running around on me. Now, he thinks I'm running around on him. What can I do? I'm not running around on him. Well, first thing I would suggest, go back and see that marriage counselor. Like I said earlier, a few questions back, sometimes men have a harder time with these things than women do. And maybe his halo's getting tight. In other words, he's doing good, the marriage is going okay, and he's feeling a little uncomfortable. So, depends on how jealous he is. He may need a little help to get over that. But quite seriously, I would suggest going back and see the marriage counselor. The one who helped before probably work again. Here's a question. We see a lot of this sort of thing. Somebody asked me, what is this stuff about timeout? People using timeout with children. What's the basis for it? Well, think about it. Timeout. To take a person out of the setting is the old-fashioned way of shaming somebody. To put them incommunicado, to put them out of communication with other people, that's a very strong punishment. Has been in societies for generations and centuries. It's also an opportunity for people to rethink, for a child to think over what's been going on. And timeout seems to work. There used to be a movie, I say used to be, I presume it's still available, Man Without a Country. That was a timeout. That was a form of punishment. In the colonies here in the States, some of the colonies came over and they used a form of discipline that had been used in their home country. It was mostly a German and a Dutch behavior. MIddleton, which was people in the community turned their back on the person who was to be punished. That's a timeout. And so how long could a person go? Timeouts work up until the point where the child says, I'm not going to. Then you have another problem. But most of the time, it'll respond, the child will respond if you say anything, then it's double time. You have to stay in timeout twice as long. So children get the message, and most children don't want to be alone, they don't want to be neglected, so that's why it works. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. It's Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start with says, what do you think about raising the age for Social Security? I guess people, some of these debates and a lot of stuff going on. Well, I'm very much in favor of it. I've talked about that for several years. You know, when Social Security was put into effect back in the mid-30s, that's when they were figuring it out. It went into effect in 1937. Well, the life expectancy at that time was considerably less than it is now, and so basically it was set up on a program in the 1920s, mortality table, the life expectancy in the 1920s. So people weren't expected to live much beyond age 65. The average person was going to die about that age. So the amount of contribution that a person was expected to make was supposed to supplement. Let it be possible to have something to live on. Well, what happens? Go to Social Security office today to talk about retirement, and if you are 65, chances are you're expected to live 16, 17 more years. Well, how much money does that take to give you something to live on, a minimal amount most of the time? But I don't see how they can avoid raising the age. And also, of course, there's another problem that we've talked about before several times. The dependency ratio is changing quite significantly. Fewer people to support the people who are retiring. We have disabilities, which we didn't used to have. When Social Security first came into being, there was no such thing as disability. I mean, there was no payment for being disabled. Here's one that comes up pretty frequently in conversations. People are concerned about what they see and what they hear, and it's called the violence in the media. And we've always had violence, but we haven't always had media. And I think a recent example, the Columbine school. What we seem to have learned is that the kids who were the perpetrators were playing to the media. If there had not been a media, if those kids hadn't expected to be glorified, if you will, in some kind of media, chances are things like that wouldn't have happened. Because they put the priorities. It's more important to get media attention than the lives of the people. Well, that situation has always been around. That's not new in itself. But the idea that one can have worldwide recognition almost instantly, yes, that's new. People talk about violence. No, we've always had violence. Go back as far as written history. There have always been violent people. And maybe we actually have less violence now, except in the media. Saturday morning cartoons, something that I can't watch. I say I can't. They're too violent. There's nothing funny about it. The cartoons were made to be humorous, I thought. And they just, one violent act after another. You know, the road runner, the rabbit that gets smashed 1,000,000 times over. Yeah? What kind of violence do you want? Some people like it. Here's another one. It says, my little girl has a heart rate of 130. She's only a year and a half old. Why should she have such a high heart rate? Well, first, talk to your doctor. But at a year and a half old, 140 isn't necessarily a high heart rate. That depends on the condition, the size, the weight. There are a lot of factors that go into that, but young children, very young children, have a high heart rate compared to adults. But talk to your health specialist. That's not my specialty. So questions like that, don't bother about calling somebody who may be friendly, but not as knowledgeable. Get straight information. Here's another one. My oldest daughter is a very real helper. She's trying hard to fill in for her mother who just left. Is that abnormal? No. There's a thing called the eldest child syndrome, which is pretty common. There's even a book by that title. When a parent dies or leaves or whatever happens, a parent is out of the home. It used to be very common. The eldest child was really expected to take over and help with the younger children particularly. But the eldest child syndrome is a pattern where the eldest child seems, even without being asked, without being expected to, tends to take over, want to take over and fill in. And I think it's a good thing. So count your blessings. Just be sure that this daughter doesn't miss her own childhood. That's the problem. Sometimes, used to be, particularly a couple of generations ago, that when the mother died, the oldest daughter had to take over the family, quit school, and basically rear the children. Some of you could recall that sort of thing. Rear the younger children. And be the mother. Now, that wasn't pathological, but as far as I know, it didn't really hurt the younger children. They were benefiting a great deal. And most of the time, as far as I know, and I've known many of them who've done that, it didn't really hurt the eldest daughter. She just sort of moved out of her family, taking care of her brothers and sisters, into her own family. And I've heard a few of them saying, I never had a break. I just went from taking care of one set of children to my own. But it's a natural thing to happen. So go with it. It's not a problem. Just make sure that girl gets some fun and recreation. Has a childhood also. Here's another one, also talking about just my teenagers are a bit much. Is there really any remedy for all that talking on the phone? Well, are you ready to take the phone out? Are you willing to wait a couple of years? One of the characteristics of adolescence is to be talkative. It's called lability, the label of the lips. They move their mouth a great deal. They're mouthy. Now that's a normal, healthy teenager, normal, healthy adolescent, particularly the young teenager. They also like groups. They like to be in groups more than the younger ones and the older ones. They also have a low frustration tolerance, meaning they do tend to react quickly to frustrations. That doesn't mean they can't be disciplined. And they don't have good judgment. They're indifferent to the world at large. Those are characteristics of healthy adolescents. But I also hear complaints about they're not answering call waiting, and or they tie up the family phone line with a computer, and so people can't get in. Well, you can't have call waiting with a computer line, but whatever it is. Getting into that, I guess you could. People have now for quite a while complained about teenagers talking, particularly on the phone. Some families get them their own phone. Some families get the call waiting so that it's understood and accepted that if a call comes in to the parent, for the parent, then they don't have to miss out. That used to be the main concern. Well, let's go to another one. It says my wife is a cleaning freak, or it seems that way because she insists on cleaning my office and my desk. What can I do about it? Well, one, you can just sit back and be glad she does. That's acquiescing. You probably don't. Maybe your desk or workshop needs cleaning. On the other hand, why not have a little conversation with her and ask her why it's so important? Share with her if it's important to you to have your own space, your own private area and territory. Well, then why not share that with her? It is important for a lot of people, and more important for some than others, naturally. But some people just can't do without it. In other words, their whole identity is wrapped up in having some kind of space, something to call their own. And I've known of, so far it's just been the wives, known of several of them, who insist on getting in and rearranging and cleaning up everything their husband has put so carefully in a place. It may not look right to the wife, but it fits what he wants to do. And the husband comes back and finds that his stuff is out of place. It doesn't necessarily mean it's in the wrong place, it's just not where he left it, and it's disturbing to him. So why not have a little conversation about it? Ask her about her own space. Now, people who do that may very well have their own space and their own territory. May not like it if you went to her particular space and rearranged her things. I'm not suggesting you do that. That may cause a little more fur to fly than you want. That's retaliation and revenge, but why not have a conversation about it? Probably get by all right. Now, I've seen guys bring in the carburetor and put it in the middle of the dining room table and say, I own this house, this is my table, I have a right to put it there. And sometimes that's kind of troublesome to the wife, particularly if it's a highly varnished, very well-made table. It can be expensive. And he brings in car parts and things like that and wants to put them there. I've heard of that. Well, that's taking territory a little far, isn't it? Well, here's one. It says, I'm having trouble with my 15-year-old with pornography on the internet. What can I do about it? I hear this about husbands, too. I've heard this several times from wives. What can you do about it? With a 15-year-old, are you willing to take the computer out, the PC? Probably not. Have you tried talking and asking why it's so important? And recognize that a 15-year-old is much more interested in sex. They're growing and blossoming. And interest in sex is perfectly healthy, perfectly normal. But the pornography is not a good substitute. People tend to get habituated on that sort of thing. So why not recognize it's normal, but it needs to be controlled. needs to be put in perspective. To be pornographic, it has to be illicit and has to be erotic. And so the themes keep changing. The people who program this stuff know that people get tired of the same themes over and over again. And so it's no longer stimulating, erotic. But it always has to be illicit in order to be pornography. That's the difference between, say, nakedness, which can be a very real, genuine art form, and something that's erotic. The nakedness in an art form is typically not illicit. It's presented in such a way to make it licit by comparison. So, looking and thinking and being around the teenager sets the example. Too many fathers tell their sons not to watch it, and then they'll sit down and watch it. So the wives tell me. Sometimes the husband will tell me. I had one just the other day saying my wife's much worse about pornography than I ever was. Typically women aren't as much into that as men are, but with a 15-year-old or any adolescent, you can block it, you can unplug it, you can take it out, you can discuss it, talk, and set a good example. Well, here's a question that's been up down the pike many times, says, do you really think that a family can live on one person's wages today? Not on minimum wage, but the answer is yes. I think one wage family can make it, generally. You know, the market follows how much money comes into the family. The markets go up, prices go up. If the family has more money, it goes down if families don't have the money. So the market follows the income follows the market, of course. But we spend a great deal of money these days on non-essentials. It's just remarkable. If you really stop and start making a list of essentials, start really identifying what you have and should have to live comfortably, and you make a list of that, it's really remarkable how many things we don't need that we're buying. If you go to a grocery store, what do you come out with? Go to a so-called drugstore. What are they? Most of them are variety stores nowadays with a pharmacy department. They have everything under the sun in them. What do you come out with? You go to a grocery store, you look down the long aisles of animal food, pet foods. There are long aisles of fancy kinds of things that really aren't essential. That's what the second salary so often goes for. Another car, fancier clothes, a lot of things that we may consider convenient, but not really essential. So yes, people can live on one salary. They may not like it for a while, but they can adjust to it, and they may even be better off. Well, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Well, to start with today, we have a question that's not quite family life. It says, can you explain the term justifiable war? Well, a lot of things come under discussions in families. I think I can. A justifiable war basically is a self-defense. We are obliged to defend ourselves and our families from threats, death, specific harm, and that's justifiable. We're also obligated to do so, and if we were to fail to do so, that can be a wrong. But it also has to be in proportion. In other words, what we do to defend ourselves is not supposed to be greater than the harm that's going to be inflicted on us or our families. But that basically is what a justifiable war is. It's self-defense. And the party who asked the question, yes, you get into some of the things we've been going around with lately. You know, I read somewhere that the old school of military expected about 10% civilian casualties in war, and the rest were military. What I read, kind of bothersome, was that has reversed. What we're seeing is 90% civilian casualties and about 10% military for these war things that are going on. It kind of bothers me. It bothers me a whole lot. Well, here's one. I'm an 80-year-old, and I can remember reading about youth camps in Nazi Germany and community care of children in the Soviet Union. And this old lady says, aren't we in the modern world basically doing the same thing? We seem to be. Unfortunately, I agree with her. We seem to be eroding the family. I mention this often, but we do seem to be doing that. We're extending child care earlier and earlier, daycare centers, feeding children at school, breakfast, after-school programs. We're moving into, yes, institutional care away from the family. And that's what Nazi Germany did. That's what the communists did, and it didn't work for them. Even the Jewish communities in the 1900s tried to set up community nurseries, did set up community nurseries and have specialty people take care of children to free the parents for work. It was an anti-family communes. That was intentional. Basically, they didn't work out well. And I don't think they're going to work out well in this country. We already see the overwhelming evidence that this type of thing just really is not the best for children. We see people, as has happened in some countries, they set it up for the higher class so that the higher class people are not encumbered by such menial tasks as taking care of children. They want their children to be reared properly, but who do they put them with? Lower class. The lower class people take care of children. That's the way it has been in some societies. We don't have that class business quite as strong in this country. But what's the salary of a daycare worker? What kind of competencies do they have? Are they teachers? Are they healthcare people? Are they people who are really trained to take care of children? Most of the time, no. They also may be distraught mothers. And all of this change is supposedly to satisfy the need of the working mother. And I'm not sure that's a need, but anyway, before somebody runs me out of town, I guess I'll change subject. Here's one. Isn't it better, and I hear this question often, isn't it better for children to have a peaceful one-parent family home than a two-parent family home where there's a lot of fighting going on? In other words, the question is based on, isn't divorce better and there be peace after the divorce? The question's logical, but the answer, no, it doesn't seem to work out that way. It doesn't seem to work out that way. The children, studies of children, seem to be better with the two-parent family, even though the two-parent family sometimes there's a lot of conflict than children in one-parent families. And then, too, divorce doesn't necessarily solve the conflicts. There can be a great deal of conflict, bad situations for people after divorce. Some people think that divorce automatically gets rid of the fight and squabbles. It just sort of moves it sometimes. It gets worse. My recommendation is for people to fix the problem. You know, if they spend as much time and energy trying to repair the problem that's causing the conflict and the strife, as they do after a divorce, trying to make fair arrangements, equitable arrangements, trying to get everything solved so as to protect children. They could probably do a better job and be happier in the long run. But in that context, here's another question: says, who suffers more from divorce, men or women? It used to be quite clear, and it was quite obvious to most anybody, that women suffered more because they lost income, they lost support, they had to go to work. They usually had been out of the workforce, so they had to go to work and starting off at lower wages. Family support were not really enforced. Even though there may have been an agreement, there would be child support payments. Excuse me, some of these things are balancing out in a sense that child support payments are being enforced much more than they used to be. But the truth is that both of them suffer. Both men and women suffer emotionally. That seems to be quite evident based on some good research. Good research done just across the border up here and over on the western side of Canada, research in some of the other countries. It's also been well known that both men and women benefit emotionally from marriage, particularly if they believe in it. Take a person who really believes in marriage, gets married, they seem to benefit. Their emotional health, their physical health improves. That's been a puzzle for a lot of people. We've also known that divorce then is associated with greater health problems and emotional problems. Well, here's an interesting one. If time out works for kids, how about for parents? I'll add for grandparents. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. There's not a thing wrong with telling a child, well, whatever's going on bothers me right now. I'm going to take a time out, and I'll come back in about 10 minutes and we'll discuss it. If the children are old enough, it's a safe situation where you can leave the children. I think time out for adults is great. To recognize that sometimes you're getting overstressed. Your temper's getting too much. You're starting to make judgments on the basis of anguish. That shouldn't be. Take a time out, take a break. And if you can't do it physically because the children are not old enough to be left alone, then do it mentally. Just say it out loud. Well, I'll come back and talk about this in a minute, but right now, everything's going to be on hold. It's a good idea. Time out works. Well, here's one that also comes up pretty frequently. You see it so often. But this party said, I hear some parents tell their children many times over to do something or not do something. Is there a better way? Well, obviously, yes. But you know, if you look at these people who do this and you study them, as I sometimes do have that opportunity, you see that the parents do that because it's the parent who wants to. It's not the child who's really misbehaving. In a sense, it's the parent who sets that pattern up because the parent feels a need to hassle, to nag. And may not be unhappiness with a child. It may be a life pattern. It may be unhappiness with who knows, a spouse, the other parent, grandparents. People sometimes get into that. They want to nag. No, I don't think that should be. I think you can be brief. You can be clear. You can tell a child. And I recommend this. If you're going to change a pattern and the child's old enough to be in conversation, have a little gathering and say, I've done this in the past, but as of a certain time, let's say beginning tomorrow, I'm going to try to start a new way and tell you once to do something or not to do something. And that's all. I'm going to try to be consistent, and what I really want you to do is just to recognize that that's all I'm going to do. And if you don't do it, then we go into some other form of discipline. But it takes a pattern of changing a habit. And so many times parents have a habit of doing that. They say something to a child and you watch them, you listen to them. They don't even expect the child to comply. Like, don't do that, don't do that. I hear that so often. Go down a store, a grocery store, department store, toy stores, all that sort of thing, drug stores. You hear people telling their children, don't touch that, don't touch this. And sometimes the child is just touching things to see if the parent will react. You see the child sometimes touch something and look, wait for the parent, say don't do it. Well, set a pattern, change, and expect the change to be followed. This one. A man was rather concerned. He'd gone to a lot of trouble to pick out a very special present, birthday present, for his son. And he was telling me, he didn't pay any attention to the present. He started playing with a box. Was there something abnormal? The father was puzzled because it was a glittering, shiny, highly colored, expensive present. The father had gone to a lot of trouble to get just the right thing. And there the youngster was playing with the box. Well, that's what children need. They need an opportunity to use their imagination. What that father had gone to a great deal of trouble to buy was something to satisfy himself, what he thought the child wanted. He really wasn't thinking in the context of the child's needs. The child needs, in that one particularly, develop his imagination, his personality. Toys where children can put them together in different ways and form different things are often much better than the finished toy that looks more like something to put in a showcase rather than to play with. Fewer toys, simpler things. I've seen that sort of thing. That particular father was really devastated because it was obviously, he was ego involved about, he wanted the child to really enjoy that toy as a favor to him. Here's another one. Come back to pornography. He says, what is it with all this pornography? Can't people live without it? Well, sure they can live without it. Pornography has to be illicit and erotic, or it doesn't qualify for pornography. So it has to keep changing. The themes have to keep changing, whatever it is, the plots are. If people are used to something, it's no longer exciting to them. So what do we want? Is a remedy to have it all over the place so it's no longer exciting? Well, I, for one, don't particularly want that. That might cure one problem, but it would bring on some more. Here's a rather delicate question. Because I'm a stepmother, and my husband expects me to control our 12-year-old, his son. But when I try, the son rightfully says, you're not my mother. The father doesn't support me. What can I do? Well, you and that father get together, discuss this clearly. You have a responsibility of being bucked to you. You don't want it, but you are not being given the authority that goes with the responsibility. So once you and the father agree really on what the discipline should be and what kind of care should be given, whatever the age of the child, what your role is supposed to be, have it clear between the two of you, and then have it clear, have a discussion with the child or children. what you're supposed to be, what you're not going to be doing, what you will be doing, what is their expectation, what are their duties, what are their obligations. It's very important to have that clear. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. To start with today, question that kind of hits home. Says, is it true that old people get grumpy? I don't know. I'll tell you when I get old. But actually, the answer is not really. Here's what usually happens. People who are grumpy when they're younger usually turn out to be grumpy old people. People who are happy and jolly, jovial, and they're younger turn out the same way when they get old. Except, what happens sometimes with older people more often is that they're also ill or they're disabled in some way. And if you apply the same standard to a young person who's ill or disabled in some way, maybe in pain, they're more edgy. They're more likely to be grumpy too, not because of age. So, in some societies, old people are expected to act differently, and so the old people have to work on it to act like they're supposed to. In some societies, studying gerontology and the study of old people around the world, the old people are given a license to be children again, to act like a child. A rather interesting contrast. In some societies, they're not supposed to do that at all. They're supposed to be much more reserved, refined, and so on. But in all societies, older people are supposed to be wiser, and wisdom when they're too old to set a bad example. They're supposed to be giving good advice. So, old people, just expect to grow up and be what you are. Here's another one. Said somebody called me a homophobic. I don't have a phobia, and I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Well, that's a political term, actually. It's the way it's being used today. It means a fear of man, literal word. But it's used to signify somebody who has a prejudice against homosexuals. And it's usually a demeaning term, a derogatory term, a put-down. If one person calls another one homophobic, that's usually what really is involved. But it may say more about the person who uses the term than the one who's intended to be being put down. So, I know very few people who would qualify to be homophobic, although I've known a lot of people who've been called that. Here's another one. It says, my husband seems to be hooked on a computer. Is it addictive? It's an interesting question. When you think about addiction, addiction usually means that when whatever is being used, whether it's a drug, or in this instance an activity, if it's withdrawn, the person has withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms by being grumpy, being unpleasant, being grouchy, being irritable, easier to get a reaction out of them, or as some people say, to get a rise out of them. And if you use that definition of addiction, it seems that some people are hooked on a computer. They're very uncomfortable unless they're with a computer. I've had several cases, I think the first one was about 5 years ago, where people were so involved with a computer, made arrangements to meet people that they had met, talked with, back and forth in their computer language, to leave their home, their place of residence, and go meet somebody. One person went all the way to Florida. Very sudden departure. Somebody else went to Pennsylvania recently. I've known people to travel out of state. Some of these people, and to talk about being addicted. It's habituation, yes. They have the habit. Now, what is it about the computer? I don't guess I really know the answer. I think it's interesting, though, that we do have people who have relationship with machines. You know, the first time we saw that I'm aware of, when vending machines were first put in mental hospitals, they were just ordinary vending machines, soda, cigarette machines. But we found that some patients tended to develop relationships with these machines. I recall psychological workshops and studies, and one of them was down here at State College, Pennsylvania, where this was part of a program being presented to the American Psychological Association about using machines to get people to relate and to study the relationship in order to know them better, to become therapeutic. And it was very interesting. Well, what we're seeing now, in fact, I have a book about psychotherapy by way of cybernetics, using the computer to dispense, if you will, kind of counseling and psychotherapy. I don't particularly go for it. I don't particularly like it, but that's my prejudice. For example, in ad for Yellow Pages, that sort of thing, I was pushed recently to use my email address in the listing. I don't really want to get into that with people. It's not that some people couldn't benefit, but I think more often the dangers outweigh the benefits. I think if people have a need to relate, okay, start relating. Find somebody to talk to. A good friend. Start with mother. Start with father. Don't try to set it up with a machine. Now, I've used the machine kind of thing, a computer, this way with some people. One of these people who went off to meet somebody was a shy, retiring person, but felt more secure, more comfortable about going out of town to meet somebody who had been met on the computer. Well, what was really behind it? I thought the person needed to have more self-esteem, more encouragement, and so we used that as proof that there was the ability to meet people. And so transferring it from long distance, which sometimes turns out to be a terrible situation, transfer it to something local where the person could practice meeting real people. Much more satisfying in the long run. And I think it works well that way, if you can turn it around. We're not sure where all this is going. I'm not, at least for one. In the book I have on cybernetics and psychotherapy, it's good to check in. That's the way it sometimes is used. You can do the same thing with telephone answering machines. You can call up and leave a message for a therapist. The therapist can call back and give you opinions. And sometimes that's how a computer can work to your benefit. Excuse me. Here's another one, though, that's a puzzling question that's come up with a couple of families, and it has many ramifications. A woman says, I belong to one church, and my husband belongs to another one. We have 3 children. I want to go to my church, but my husband tells me and says that I promised when we got married to allow the children to be reared in his church, but he doesn't take them. He wants me to take them. What should I do? It's a very real, it's an honest concern, because there are a lot of lives involved here. Actually, 5, according to the statement. The children don't particularly want to go to either one of them, she adds. What's going on? Well, the father is reneging on his promise. If he got this mother, wife at the time, to promise to let the children be reared in his church, chances are he made an even stronger promise that he would rear the children in his church. So start with that one. Start with the father. What's he really expect? Why is he not living up to his promise? Now, we get into a situation here, the age of the children. Have they been baptized? Are the children themselves old enough to sense an obligation to feel this sort of thing? What is the pattern to be? It would be a good idea to talk to the pastors, both of them. What would be their suggestions? But involve the father, because it's his responsibility if he made that promise. And if both of you made promises, then why not carry it out, whatever the church may be? What is the history here? Is one person going to be feeling that a lot of concessions have been made? And what do the concessions mean? And dealing with a lot of families, sometimes different churches, the churches themselves may have very little difference in them. Sometimes I've found that a husband may say, well, this is the church I want to go to because of something, and the wife say, well, no, this church I want to go to. Sometimes it's the same denomination, but the people are more friendly in one according to one than the other. They're all kinds. You always find personalities. A church group, a denomination, a congregation always has a personality, which may be more suitable to one than the other. And sometimes, like the extremes I've tried to work with, I remember a couple where she was Roman Catholic, and when they got married, she took a vow of rearing her children Catholic. The husband had been reared in Judaism, and he had the same expectations that he would rear children in Judaism. Well, at the time they got married, he conceded. He didn't mention the fact that he was really expecting to rear the children in Judaism. He knew the wife, the mother-to-be, had promised to rear the children Catholic, and he went along with the ceremony. After the ceremony, the marriage, and when they started, they expected their first child. Then he brought it up that he was expected in his religion to rear the children in the Judaic religion. There's no way to reconcile those two things. There's no way. Was he wrong to not mention it? Yes. Did he marry her under, in a sense, false pretenses? Yes. Did she marry him under false pretenses? It wasn't really clear. She was being open, she was being honest, and the expectation before they married. She thought he was agreeing and accepting it. A lot of people change churches, but very few people change religions. And the religious differences there, in some respects, are insurmountable. You can't have both people promising to rear the children in the faith if it's a Roman Catholic and Orthodox Judaism. Well, he wasn't Orthodox at the time. He wanted to become so after they got married. But it's a very serious question. Should they have gotten married? No. Not if this is really their beliefs, but this was after the fact. The fault was the people who were involved in the marriage preparation. This thing should have been discovered and openly discussed. And it's much better to assume that people are not going to change religions. That doesn't mean that mixed marriages can't work. Of course they can. But when they work, it should be with clear understanding of what the expectations are and what's going to happen. Because the question that the woman submitted here about how to handle this, it's a real situation. And it comes up pretty often. I've seen mothers who were not Catholic, where children go through all of the sacraments with them and preparations for them and do a beautiful job, even though they themselves were not Catholic. I've known of several cases like that. Turn it around the other way. Fathers do the same thing. What happens too often is that the people will both give up their own particular religion and they'll try to find a third one. And sometimes that leads to unhappiness for everybody. Or they simply will just give up religion altogether and say, we can't make it work. Might as well forget it. Now, children need religion. I recommend that. Children need religion. They need a stability. They need security in knowing that there is a morality. There are some rights and wrongs. There are some indelible rights and wrongs. Not everything is relative. And they need it. They'll benefit from it. Later, when children have a firm hold on a particular religion, then they can be secure enough to study others and may make an adult decision to change religions. That'll be their choice. But to say you're going to leave it up to the children and not expose them to anything, no, I think that's a disservice to children. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. To start with today, I have an interesting question. Somebody who came in and said, I grew up in the 40s and 50s, and we never had no-fault divorce then. What's it supposed to do that's better than the old-style divorce? Well, first I can say, wow, what a question. There's several things that no-fault divorce was supposed to do. It was supposed to improve some things. Of course, with any kind of social change like that, there are some problems that came along with it. First, it was to remove the divorce from the adversarial proceeding in courtrooms. Any older people can remember movies, things of that nature that showed courtroom scenes about divorce. The dirty courtroom battles, and because it was an adversarial proceeding, in other words, whoever filed for divorce had to make allegations, file statements that talked about people who were somehow falling down on their marriage vows. No fault was intended to protect children from these things. In other words, supposedly in a no-fault divorce situation, children could be excluded from any and all consideration and not have to be subjected or learning about all the allegations that one parent accused the other one of. Another one, no fault was supposed to avoid the high legal cost because somebody makes allegations and then you have to defend yourself, and sometimes the defense was rather expensive. The no-fault divorce was really promoted a great deal to avoid the battles and the embitterment of turning one parent against the other one, which of course would have an influence on the children, so that people could have an amicable divorce, an amicable, friendly divorce. Sometimes that happened, sometimes it still does. still doesn't, but it was also supposed to simplify court proceedings. Now, when you had an adversarial proceeding, you had to have a contest, basically, allegations and proof and disproof, defenses. It took up a lot of court time. Well, no-fault divorce is supposed to clear all that out so that no-fault situations could be, paperwork could go through without really getting into courts. It was supposed to be a pattern where people could leave what they called a bad marriage so that they'd have an opportunity to have a good one. And interestingly enough, a lot of people claimed it was going to lower divorce rates. Well, let's look at some of the things that did happen with no-fault divorce. And first of all, it didn't lower divorce rates. The people who clamored and kept saying that, well, this will lower divorce rates, it seemed to increase. A good statistical analysis shows that people were saying, well, we'll change the law because that's already the pattern that people are going into. It didn't seem to really work that way. The patterns that people were supposed to have, they didn't end in divorce as nearly as often as after no-fault divorce came in. I think the rather famous sociologist here, Norvell Glenn, has now analyzed this material and found that really no-fault divorce cuts into people's commitment to marriage. As long as there's a no-fault option, people don't seem to me to be willing to make as deep a commitment to marriage itself. So that's a rather serious pattern. Interestingly enough, the state becomes a partner of whoever signs the petition to have the divorce proceeding. And that wasn't an intention, but it seems to work that way. So the one who, the one who files for divorce really seems to get the benefit. Another one, the legal fees. Well, most of us know that any profession that has a fee, that's part of the income, something comes along and people say it's going to reduce the fees. Most professionals don't want to drop their income, so legal fees were put in accordingly. I noticed in the papers and different magazines that legal fees now, the paper itself, the filing can be obtained for no contest divorce where children are not involved, property is not involved, for $200. Well, $200 for filling out a form is still pretty good pay. No-fault divorce was supposed to take it out of the adversarial proceeding where the lawyers got up and battled it out and turn it over to mediators where people could settle their differences privately and quietly. Well, sometimes it works. That's fine. But then sometimes that doesn't work. It was also supposed to allow people to cool off. You filed for divorce, and basically under the no-fault divorce pattern, there's no contest if you've been separated for 1 year. Unfortunately, though, what goes on during that 1-year separation sometimes just obviates any opportunity for reconciliation. New York had a reconciliation statute. When people file for divorce, before the no-fault divorce, the statutes required that they try to seek reconciliation. That was supposed to be something to really preserve the family. Good intentions, but there were very few people. For example, when I came to New York State and started on the faculty at Plattsburgh State in '68, I was the only marriage counselor between Albany and Montreal. And I immediately started teaching courses and teaching people how to do marriage counseling. But the reconciliation statutes was a good idea, but there wasn't anyone, or there were very few people who were really trained to get into it. The separations now, the pattern is people will separate. They sometimes don't even bother with divorce. They take up with new girlfriend, new boyfriend, whichever the case may be. It could be same sex or different sex. And it's wreaking havoc with the children. Children talk about my mother's boyfriend, my father's girlfriend, and there may not even be a divorce situation. Well, that leads over to another question about deadbeat dads. I had somebody who very sarcastically talked about deadbeat dads. Apparently this man had been, according to his statement, he had really been disenfranchised from his family. He had been made a goat. He claimed he was totally innocent of allegations, but he was being labeled a deadbeat dad and was having to pay for support. He had no options about what really the support money was going for. He wanted to provide for his children, but he also wanted to have some say and some input as to what was happening to the children. But instead he was labeled a deadbeat dad, and there he was. Well, the no-fault divorce and the deadbeat dad situations kind of go along together. We never hear about deadbeat moms, do we? But supposedly, under the new divorce laws, under these patterns, either parent may be made to pay support. But it's strange that the support payments go to the parent, typically. And there is no way of enforcing what's going to happen to the money itself. I've had people talk to me about this sort of thing and really be upset because the support payments that were being made and made regularly in full compliance with decrees and court orders and so on, court agreements, once it was made, it was totally out of the hands of the person making it. And I've listened to, so far the fathers talk about what the money was being used for. And some of them would be hard-pressed to be calling it sensible child support. And some mothers have been said to just use the money totally for themselves, and so they had an extra income. The person who creates the problems. I'm all in favor of fathers supporting children. I really am. I've always had a very strong opinion. I've even participated in having some fathers put in jail for failure to support children. I think somebody who willfully and deliberately walks away, turns back on his children, well, I'm also in favor of cowboy psychiatry. I think that's very serious. When I say I've participated, never in New York State. I've not been involved in trying to put people in jail. I don't even know that it would happen. People always say, well, how can somebody in jail be supporting of a parent? Well, it's an idea that what you do is you set an example for other people. And so far, all the cases I ever worked with in which there was jail and actual supervision, then subsequently on parole, it made a believer out of the fathers. They were quite happy to be supportive of their children. You know, the no-fault divorce and the deadbeat dad situation right now, both the conservative and the liberal politicians are jumping on the bandwagon, and they're pointing as a target for social changes to take care of deadbeat dads, to provide for children. Well, it's sort of like the pattern where it used to be that, you know, apple pie and motherhood were the flag. Well, these were good things to be for, so you'd always get elected if you were for apple pie and motherhood and the flag. Well, it looks like deadbeat dads are now part of that scenario. It's a strange thing, isn't it? Say that the unwed father, imagine this now, an unwed father, typically what I try to hide I say typically, not all of them. Some of them are very conscientious. They want to provide for the children. But we have a situation, it's related to divorce. And the pro-life people and the pro-abortion people have a strange kind of, position on this sort of thing. It was supposed to liberate women, the divorce laws. What happens is, if the mother decides to have an abortion, the father has absolutely no say on it whatsoever. Legally, it's been determined in several courts in several different states, and Missouri was one of them. It first came out on the Roe v. Wade ruling. The father has no input, cannot stop an abortion. If he wanted to provide for the child, protect the child, he's powerless under that particular court ruling that has been made national and has now been absorbed in all kinds of court cases. But if the mother decides to have the child, then the father can be made to support it. And it's a strange situation. I don't really see how that can be reconciled easily. The cure for that, of course, I'm rather opinionated about that, as some of you know, is to eliminate the abortion situation. Start focusing on the family, not making divorce easier, not focusing on supporting children after divorce, but put all that energy into preserving, protecting an intact family and trying to make family life better. Help people solve those problems, and I think that would solve many of the other problems. Some of these problems just magnify and they get totally out of proportion. And yet, it's a moral situation. I think we have to do some remedial social legislation. First, though, we ought to invest in families. If we don't identify the families as most important for children and the well-being of children, then we're missing the boat. We should do no harm. Whatever social legislation comes up, we should use the old Hippocratic oath. First, I shall do no harm. And unfortunately, some of the very good intentions, people who want to do the right thing, they come up with ideas and legislation or social programs that have some serious side effects. Most of these things are moral problems, and moral problems require moral solutions. And of course, legislation, by definition, is supposed to be public and not supposed to have a moral basis. I think we need to look at contract laws. Marriages are always a contract. They are covenants. They are different religious groups. They may be sacraments. But they're always a contract, an agreement. And yet this is a very strange contract that one person can say, I don't want to be part of it, and walk away. You can't do that in any other kind of contract. And the courts are upholding that right and left, actually. I say right and left. I don't know of any politicians, either on the right or left, who want to come along and tackle that problem. It's a big one. And we're talking about rights and rights and rights. Well, I think a child has a right to have a family. I think a child has a right to have his childhood involve his own parents. His or her parents. I think that should be a basic right for children. And until we want to really come to grips with that, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I had an inquiry about so-called Catholic divorce. what is it and how does it really differ from any other kind of divorce? Well, Catholics don't get divorces as such under the church law. Catholics get divorces like anybody else gets divorces under civil law. And the basic procedure, as I understand it, is that most priests will not entertain people's petitions or requests for an annulment until they're at least in the process of getting a civil divorce. In other words, the people have to show that is quite a serious consideration. I am well aware that some people consider the possibility of annulment before they ever file for divorce. And the reasons are rather peculiar, I think. Peculiar for this reason, that the intent to have a church wedding is still very important for people. Most weddings take place in churches. Even though the number of marriages and the percentage of weddings and marriages for the population has gone down, the majority are still in churches, and they want a big public affair. I found that out in research many years ago. The church, the Catholic Church here, in terms of annulment, about 30 years ago, came into the recognition that a psychological factor could be involved in annulments. Basically, the grounds for an annulment is that there was something present either at the time of the wedding or was existing before the wedding, which was known. You have to prove the existence of it, that there was an impediment. There was something that kept that relationship from being what's called a sacramental marriage, a sacramental relationship. And that impediment then continues. So that sometimes people say, well, somebody has 2 or 3 children, they've been married for 10 years, and they get an annulment. What's the sense of that? Well, there may not be any sense to it. Sometimes the sense of it is that there was indeed an impediment. There was not a sacramental bond. Many people get married and have for years and years, with or without any church affiliation. And if it was a problem of the form or the right procedure, then yes, it could be set aside. If it was a problem of an impediment that was due to something in the person, if it was a fraudulent contract, my experience with the tribunals, the divorce courts, in several dioceses, is that most of the people are conscientious. The canon lawyers are usually the ones who are the judges, people who specialize in the law, and they're serious. There's been a great increase in this, and a great increase in the number of annulments granted in, say, the last half of the 20th century. Tremendous increase, particularly in the Western cultures. Most of them being based on psychological factors, the big increase. The old grounds are always there, that there was incompetency, the person was not at the right age. Of course, age is always changing. The person had not the proper procedure, the forms, or there may have been pre-existing conditions, and these conditions vary, that were indeed considered under the old canon law before 1983 and the new canon law after that, that prevented the marriage from being truly sacramental. Sacramental has a special meaning for Catholics. And for most of the Protestant Christians, they don't consider the marriage as a sacrament. And so that's the biggest difference with people. And of course, as time goes on, more and more people are following the basic civil pattern. And it's getting to be harder and harder to tell Catholics from Protestants in terms of their practice. Those are well-known facts. But the courts still are there. An annulment is an annulment which says simply that the marriage did not take place because it could not have taken place. A decree of nullity that's what that says. What happens to the children, both in civil law and in ecclesiastical law, canon law? All children who have been born to a union, whether or not it has annulment, are considered legitimate. So it does not have an impact on the legitimacy of children. Here's another question that came up. It says, is there any relationship between school violence and broken homes? Answer is very clearly yes. Very clear statistical analysis shows that. In spite of all of the media coverage on a few cases of recent years, like the last 3 years particularly, where we've had an outbreak of school violence, very severe violence, and children in those situations were from intact homes. The majority of the studies show the majority of children who are involved in violence are from broken homes, even with taking guns to school. It's been found that there is an association between broken homes, and children from broken homes are 2 or 3 times more likely to carry a gun to school as children from intact homes. Well, here's another one. It says, when I started to normal school at Plattsburgh State, some of you remember Plattsburgh State, or Plattsburgh Normal School, a long time before it became a state college. It was held in Hawkins Hall. Well, the question says, when I started there, we learned that people had children because they needed people to work on the farms. What happens when the farms disappear? Well, as the farms disappear, so do the number of children disappear. It would appear to be related, but I suspect that's not a true relationship. I've never found a couple who had sex in order to get a farmhand. I heard that. I studied this sort of thing. I've heard it a lot about farmers like to have large families. Farmers with large families, anybody knows taking care of children, a small child is demanding of time and attention. So older children are very good farm hands. But I think the problem is this. People who were on farms had a different perspective. I think they enjoyed life, they were around life, creativity, and having children was a much more natural situation. People on farms were not crowded space typically. They may have had a small house and a large barn, but space was not an issue. People living in a small city apartment would likely consider, well, how many bedrooms they needed, that sort of thing, much more than the farm people. But the farm family and the family in the city that was running a small family business, very similar. And I'm all in favor of that. And the advantage for the farm family and the family of small business is typically the children have jobs to do. They have chores to do. The children become part of the family enterprise, whatever that is. And I think that's something very serious that has been lost. I think it's been very positive in children. When children are part of it, the children know they are part of whatever the family enterprise is. They don't need classes in school on self-esteem. They are producing, they're productive, they have the feeling of being important, an integral part of the overall pattern of the family. And I think that's very healthy. And what we see today is so many parents don't have any chores, any task assigned to children. They give them allowances, and I think allowances ought to be separate and apart from chores that are assigned to children, but that's my prejudice here. But I've watched it over a period of several decades. I think children who are a meaningful part of families are happier. Not only happier, but they're also being prepared. They're learning trades, they're learning skills, people who live on farms learn to do a lot of different things. And these are skills that can be transferred directly into technology today for machinery work, for all sorts of things. The farm boys in the military, at least in World War II, were well respected because they basically came with a set of skills. The city dudes, so to speak, most of them were kind of like the wax and the waves of women who joined the military. Most of them did not have big experiences about how to do practical things. But the question's an interesting one to look at, I think, about farm families. We're having fewer and fewer farms. The farms are getting larger. They're being bought out by big corporations. People are being employed by the corporation to run the farms. But the concept's still there. I think the idea of family enterprise, if a family has only a small apartment in an urban area, I think they could still have children with chores, children to do things, the family itself doing things. And don't forget the neighbors. There are plenty of things to do if people are willing to do them. How about the neighbors who can't do for themselves, who need a sidewalk shoveled, plowed, lawns mowed, storm windows to put up or take down? There are all kinds of things children can learn to do and do for others, and it's healthy. Being a good neighbor. Who takes care of the cemeteries? We used to have regular days where people would go do that sort of thing, where people would mow lawns, mow the cemetery, repair fences, repair all sorts of things, go in and make it look good. All that was voluntary work. And I'm well aware that today in the large cities that people have parks department or the recreation department or some other department to do that sort of work. But these jobs could be done by children who are really looking for something to do and need something to do. Well, here's another one. It says, you've said that married people are healthier than single people. Does that include mental health? Yes, it does. Physical, mental, and emotional health. And you know, in the December issue of Neurology, that was December of '99 issue of the journal Neurology, there was a very interesting report that came to my attention. What it said was that people who are married or who have even been married have a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. It's interesting to speculate why. Now, people who are married don't have the same percentage of them developing the Alzheimer's disease. But people who have been married and separated and divorced or widowed still don't have the same level of Alzheimer's disease as other people. And it's a good, interesting question. And here's another one. It says, what have you found to help best with people with depressions? Depressions are pretty common. Well, I found that psychotherapy, social therapy, recreational therapy, used to call it work therapy, getting people to work. The exercises, prescribe that. I don't have an MD, and so therefore I don't prescribe medication. But some studies on the divorces, a study on depressions, show that psychotherapy and pharmacological therapies, medications, all of them have about the same impact. People who have had one versus the other, and controlled studies show that the results are about the same. The best recommendation nowadays is for mild depressions. By the way, that includes St. John's wort, herbal studies. But the best recommendation is the combination, to help people learn to adjust to the depression itself and have medication. It depends a little bit on what causes a depression. Some of it's caused, we think, by body chemistry. Others, it's a combination of stresses on the body. And some people seem to be almost immune from depressions. But whatever it is, I think the majority of the researchers and the clinicians have found that it's almost trial and error. Some people respond best to psychotherapy, others to chemical therapy. And so it's a sort of a trial and error. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Well, today, the question is very straightforward. It says, are you a mandated counselor? Mandated. Well, yes. Under New York statutes, mandated counselors there are mandated reporters. People who come across children who are believed to be the victims of child abuse have to report it. That's basically what the mandated counselor is. I've found situations where very questionable things going on in family life. I take a little bit slower view than some. I know some personnel, some agencies are very quick to jump in and say this is abuse. I don't quite jump as fast. Also, if a person is 18, then the mandatory reporting is out, because a person 18 is supposed to be able to report, take charge of his or her own life. So it's up to that individual as an adult then. But yes, the mandated reporting is supposed to be there. And that's why I always say, whoever talks to me, whomever, I say it's confidential to the extent of the law. In other words, if the law requires me, but I'm open about it, I'll tell people. And sometimes I have people call up and say, well, if I talk to you about thus and so, do you have to report it? Yes. I'd answer, as far as I know, whatever the circumstances may be. Well, here's another one. It says, the song in the words, people need people, suggests that we all need to be around other people. And the party was talking about monastic life, people who are hermits, people who don't seem to need other people. Well, those are the exceptions. We do seem to need people. We're all mammals, and mammals have an instinct to be around their own kind, the herd instinct. It's interesting to watch mammals. Mammals like to be around other mammals, not just their own kind. If you watch a horse out in the field of cattle, it's typically stay with the cows. Or a cow will in a pen or a lot will typically follow a horse around. Dogs and cats will even get friendly if you let them. After a while, I wondered, why do people have pets? Is that part of their herd instinct? They want to be around something? Substitute child, or what is it? I don't know. But yes, we seem to need people. Here's another question. As I look at it, I'm thinking of the last one. The last question says, can it be that some people are made for each other? That they have a body chemistry that just clicks? It's an interesting question, and I don't know of good research on that. Good research meaning I don't recall seeing any clear findings that that's true. I don't doubt it being true. What I have seen sometimes is in family situations, without being able to determine any other cause for conflict or discord, to come up with basically what would be considered a personality clash. I've seen this in mother and daughter. I've seen it in various members of a family where the people just don't get along, and they just basically don't seem to like each other. And even though in their minds they know they're supposed to love and to accept all members of the family and so on, and to feel badly about not doing so, but in their own feelings, without being able to explain it. Personality conflict. You know, we don't pick our parents, and we don't pick our own gene pool. So I'm not opposed to considering that, yes, body chemistry may indeed be a part of it. And here's something else that I've learned just recently, that we have wavelengths. Different parts of our brain has hertz. You know, hertz is a frequency, electrical frequency. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. And different parts of the brain have different frequencies. And so it occurred to me as I was looking at some of this material that, you know, we've heard people say, well, I'm not on your wavelength. May indeed we have different wavelengths. And maybe with some people we're more compatible because we are on their wavelength, and other people we're less compatible because we're not. And these wavelengths seem to vary with diseases, the way they've been studied right now, and different kinds of conditions of the brain. But when that's explored more fully, I suspect there will be much more to it about people being on the same wavelength. Maybe there's even something to telepathy. Who knows? That we're reading other people's rhythm, so to speak. We certainly can see that emotionally, but it's going to be interesting to follow that kind of research. Here's another question. It says, whatever happened to the frantic efforts to keep babies from sucking their thumbs? I remember when I was a kid, people were always telling some child to take your thumb out of your mouth, take your thumb out of your mouth. It was thought to be some kind of bad omen. And as I was a young student in psychology studying these things, well, thumb sucking was supposed to be an answer to an oral need, frustrated oral needs, according to the Freudian people, the psychoanalysts. I think all that's kind of gone down the wayside, gone down the drain now, because most people have seen sonograms. You know, sonogram of an unborn baby, and so often they're sucking their thumbs. Why do they suck their thumbs? Because it's there. Put it in front of them, baby will reach for it, will grab a hold. And that's supposedly before they get any of these social pressures and all of the bad parenting that's supposed to go along with it, and all the conflicts. They just suck the thumb because their thumb because it's there. And you know, a newborn, you scratch a newborn's cheek while they're there, turn to what you're doing. They come that way. Here's another one. Interesting question sometimes. Says, are computers making children smarter? Children smarter because of computers? You know, I don't know how to answer that in one way, because here's what we have. We seem to have had a time where scores were going down until just recently. Scores have been going back up because there's more emphasis now on the scores. But I don't really see the evidence that makes children smarter, or less adequate either. It's certainly another dimension, and it's a dimension that I admire, children who are computer literate. But it reminds me of a Chitlin's test. Now, most people in the North Country here don't know what a Chitlin is. And if you do, you probably don't want to talk about it. But a Chitlin's test was a test that came into being very specifically saying that the white middle-class urban child had an advantage in taking intelligence scores over somebody who wasn't white, who lived in a country, who was poor and didn't have the advantages. Each child learned their own environment, and they were capable and competent in their own environment. And so it was called chitlins because the people that they were describing often ate chitlins, French fried. And if the idea was if they were tested on the things in their environment, they would come out making as good a scores as the others. Maybe that's what we need to do with the computers. We see people who develop certain competencies, but we also see people who don't seem to be using the good judgment. Being able to require a computer and manage a computer to do certain things certainly requires a level of intelligence. Even though I've known non-literate people to learn computers. What we're seeing, though, maybe is an attitude where people either don't know or they don't care. We're seeing students who aren't motivated to do certain things. Recently, we've been hearing about people who are addicted, habituated sitting at a computer all day, like some people used to talk about couch potatoes, sitting just watching television, and their brain turned to mush. We're seeing more and more about people who do spend hours and hours at a computer. And maybe we need to look at it a little differently. Back to the question about what it's really doing to people, I think it's a factor in motivation more than intelligence. It reminds me of the saying, perhaps some of you have heard it or recall it, about how do you handle people, how do you approach people. And the saying goes like this: the man who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep, waking. The man who knows not and knows not that he knows is stupid, avoiding. The man who knows and knows he knows is wise, following. The man who knows not and knows he knows not is a student, teaching. Oh well, those are motivational factors, aren't they? So maybe that's what we get into. Here's a question that's it's sort of puzzling to me. The man said, I have two sons, and the problem is dividing the family. One of the sons wants to go into the military, make a career out of it, because the man who's called said he was career. The other son is just as conscientious as saying that's insane, that's crazy. Why should anybody want to go into the military? The man and his wife are divided. The mother and the father in this situation are divided. And he's saying, hey, give us a hand if you can. Well, I'm sort of prejudiced. What's going on in the military, what we read, what we see, what we hear, we have some problem with leadership. Apparently the military is having some very real problems with retention and recruitment. So with retention and recruitment being major issues today, and so many military officers and high-ranking officers are saying, not for me, and some of the policies. I guess I'm prejudiced this way. I always thought that a career in the military was great. And maybe because I started out to be a career, I was going to be a career Navy man. I got kicked out, but because of a disability. But I think that'd be great. I always have believed that if somebody is willing to defend and preserve the integrity of the country, I put that pretty high on my list. But I would have a great deal of difficulty following some of the edicts, following some of the patterns that are being forced on the military right now. So in this particular family, my suggestion is to get the family together and talk openly with each other about it, and decide what you can do about some of these problems as a family. And I'm assuming that each person in the family has a good reason for his or her position. So why not listen to them? What can be done? how can this be met as a family problem? What can you do? Well, you might join some group, do something as a group. Who knows? Let your family come up with a solution. I think you'll find it beneficial. Here's another question. The question asked me, have I ever told people to do something or prescribed them to do something which they were not trying to do and trying to keep from doing? And the answer is yes. That's a technique. It's called paradoxical intention. Where somebody's making a very diligent effort trying to keep from doing something. And so what you sometimes do in therapy, you get a crystal clear idea about it, try to, and you may try to get the person to do the very thing he's trying not to do and having trouble. Here's how it works. We don't seem to be able to do what we're trying to keep from doing. Sort of strange. That's why it's called a paradoxical intention. But for example, if I'll give a case example, I had a man who was just keeping track of his wife, everything she did. She was the one complaining. She brought him to counseling and said it's driving her bats. She doesn't know what to do with him because she can't go to stores. She said virtually she couldn't go to the bathroom without his being involved. He wanted to keep track of her every movement. Well, it seemed that he, without even knowing it himself, admitting it at first at least, he was jealous. He wanted to keep track of her. So I was listening to him, and I found out that she actually did have some free time during the 24 hours. And so I brought that to his attention, that he wasn't very good at keeping track of her because he really didn't know what she was doing. I've forgotten what the times are now. But just say, for example, between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., that he lost track of her. He didn't really have an accounting. And he should really get involved with this. Well, the man thought I was crazy, and most people who have this prescription given to them, that's their usual thought. You know, you must be nuts. Here I'm being complained about because I'm keeping track of my wife, and you're telling me to keep even more track. Well, what happens? The guy says, well, I'm not going to do that. You're nuts. The wife was a little unhappy first also, but she called me, called back after a while and said, you know, it worked. She didn't know what I was doing at first. She said, it worked. He got so disgusted with you telling him to keep track of me. He'd show you he didn't have to keep track of me. She said, well, hey, we're almost normal in our patterns in our relationship. It works. Well, there's one more question I'd like to address very simply, quickly. And that's somebody who talked about being in a double bind, being in a corner, talking about a relative that always put him in a corner. I think it's important to repeat. I've talked about this before, but I think it's important enough to repeat it. The people who have a knack for putting you in a corner probably don't do it intentionally. Any of us who are in a corner typically get angry. We feel frustrated. We feel boxed in. That's why it's called a corner. We're told something, and either way we go, we're wrong. So what do? First you analyze it. Try to keep it cool. You say, what is it? You're asking me to do this. If I do that, I'm wrong. You're asking me to do that. If I do that, I'm wrong. Or do something and not do something. If I don't do it, I'm wrong. And if I do, I'm wrong. That's a terrible situation. My suggestion for people like that, and there are all kinds, is to address it openly and say, hey, you put me in a box. Either way I go, I'm wrong, so you don't leave me any choices. I don't have anything to do except make my own decision about what I'm going to do. It doesn't have to be either one of the options given. You can come up with your own, and that's the way it ought to be. You'll be happier doing your own, and probably it's going to be better, and it's not going to make the other one mad if you address it openly. unfortunate thing, is when people do this to others. They usually are angry if you don't do what they're telling you to do. And of course, that's an impossible situation. You're going to be wrong either way. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.